This is part 67 of ASP.NET MVC tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss action selectors in MVC. First of all, let's understand what an action is. An action is a public method inside a controller. These action methods respond to an URL request. So if we want to have this action method executed, then we issue a URL request like this. Here, localhost is the name of the server, MVC demo is the name of the project, home is the name of the controller, and index is the name of the action method within that controller. So actions are public methods within a controller that respond to URL requests. Then what are action selectors? Action selectors are attributes that can be applied to these action methods, and we use action selectors to control or influence which action method gets invoked. And action name selector is one of the widely used action selector. So when do we use this one? This action selector is used when we want to invoke an action method with a different name than what is already given to that specific action method. Here, the action method name is index, and we are able to invoke that using index in the URL. Now let's say for some reason I want to invoke that using a different name like list. What happens if I try to navigate to that URL? We get an error stating the resource cannot be found. That's because within the home controller we don't have an action method with that name. But here our intention was to execute this action method using that URL. So to achieve that, simply decorate this index action method with that action name selector. So what are these selectors? They are implemented as attributes. So we simply apply an attribute called action name on this action method. So here we are specifying the name as list. Let's build this and let's refresh this and see if it's going to work. Look at that, it works now. Since we have decorated this one with action name list, we are able to invoke that using /list. Now what's going to happen if I try to navigate to index? We get an error. Once you decorate an action method with an action name attribute, then you will have to use that name to reach that action method. Alright, now here the function is simply returning a string. Now let's say we are returning back an action result, and then we are returning a view from this action method. Now what should the view be named? Should it be named index or list? It should be named list. What happens if you name it index? You'll get an error. Look at this. Let us go ahead and add a view, and let's call it index. Let me add that. Okay, now let's save everything and let's build a solution, and then let's try to refresh this and see what's going to happen. Since we have used that action name attribute, it's going to look for a view with that name. Okay, we are still navigating to the index action. We want to go back to the list. So look at that. When we try to navigate to the list, it finds this action method, and then it comes here. Okay, it says return view. So it's going to go into the views folder and look for a view with either list.aspx, ascx, or list.cshtml, bbhtml. So it's going to search all these locations, with those extensions. So the basic idea is that the view should have the same name as what you have used in that action name attribute. Okay, now let's say for some reason I still want to use that name index.cs. Index as the name of the view. Is it possible? Can we make it work? Absolutely. One way you can make it work is by passing the name of that view to this view function, because there is an overloaded version where you can pass the name of the view. So let's pass that index. Let's build it. Let's refresh this, and it should work now because it's going to find list.cshtml within the home folder. So there we go. Now on the other hand, if you simply name it list, then by convention MVC is going to look a view with that name in the home folder, so there's no need for us to specify the name of the view. So let's build this and let's refresh, and it should work as before. Okay, look at that, it still works. Alright, so action name is one of the selectors. Another selector is accept verbs selector. Let's understand this with an example. First of all, let's get rid of this home controller and the home folder within views. And I have this table TBL employee here. Let's quickly add an ADO.NET entity data model based on that table. So let's add a new item, select ADO.NET entity data model, and let's call it sample data model. And let's generate the model from the database, and let's give it a name sample DB context for our connection string. Click next. This is going to connect to the database and retrieve all the tables, views, and stored procedures. Let's expand tables. Let's select table TBL employee, and we want our models to live in models namespace. Click finish. This should generate an entity with name TBL employee, but let's change it to employee. Let's build everything, and let's add a controller, and let's call it home controller, and let's use this template, and let's select employee as our model class, and the data context class is going to be sample DB context. Let's add. This should add home controller and all the views, including the edit view. And if you look at the home controller, there should be two edit action methods, with the same name. So we have edit action method here and an edit action method here. Now let's actually build the solution. Actually, before we do that, let's go back to the edit view. There is a section called scripts. Let's get rid of that section. Let's save everything. Let's actually build our solution. And now let's go back to the home controller. So within the home controller, look at this. I have two edit actions. First of all, let's navigate to the index view. So this should list all the employees. And then once I click on this edit link, look at the URL. So we are actually going to go to /home/edit, and then we need to pass the ID of the employee that we want to edit. So when I try to navigate to this URL, which action method do you think gets executed? This action method or this action method? Now look at this. This action method is decorated with HTTP post attribute, but this one is not decorated with any attribute. Okay, so this is again an action selector here. Now accept verbs selector. So this is nothing but an accept verb selector. So we use this selector when we want to control the invocation of an action method based on the request type. Okay. Now I want this action method to respond to the GET request, but notice that by default we haven't decorated that with any attribute. So if you don't decorate an action method with an accept verb, the default is GET. So that action method is going to respond to the GET request. So when we issue this request, it is going to be a GET request. So which action method gets responded? This action method. Okay. Look at that. And what is this action method doing? Simply, we are passing an employee ID of 1. So that ID gets passed into this one. It's going to go to the database, retrieve that employee, and then it is passing that employee to the view. Okay, so we are displaying that employee details there. Now I can change this employee details, and then once I click save, which action methods get executed? This one gets executed because this is decorated with HTTP post attribute. When I submit the form, we are actually posting the data to the server. Okay, so it's a post operation, and since we have decorated this action method with HTTP post, this is going to respond to that action. Look at this. In spite of having the same name, edit here, this one responds to the GET request, this one responds to the POST request. Okay, because we have decorated them with these accept verbs. Okay, here we are saying HTTP verbs.get, here we are saying HTTP verbs.post. Now you can either use this accept verbs attribute or simply use this shortcut HTTP get and HTTP post. But then in either cases we are actually using accept verbs selector. And this is a very common interview question as well. What are the different selectors or action selectors that are available in MVC? One is the action name selector, the other one is accept verbs selector. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.